Hopefully you all have seen my previous video where I gave kind of a basic description of what vectors are, but we're going to continue to look at vectors here. Just as a reminder, a vector is a mathematical quantity that has both a size, which we generally call the magnitude, and a direction. And vectors can be described a few different ways. Visually, a vector is usually shown as kind of an arrow. Okay, and if we can talk about the size in terms of the length of the arrow, maybe we could say this has a magnitude of 3. Maybe we could say it has a direction of 60 degrees. A vector can be picked up and moved. So if I pick this vector up and I move it over here, it still has a size of 3 and it still has a direction of 60 degrees. If I move it here, still has a length of 3, still is at a 60-degree angle, and so on and so forth. Okay, so vectors can be moved anywhere you want to move them. If I had a second vector, let's say I had a vector that looks like this, and let's say that this second vector here has a magnitude of 2, and let's say that angle measures 150 degrees. You can add two vectors visually. We call this this is the head and the tail of the vector. We actually add vectors head to tail. Sorry, this is the head, this is the tail of the vector. I think I said that backwards. But you can put the two vectors together. You saw this a little bit in my video about moving on a pedestrian walkway. So if you want to add vectors visually, you can add them head to tail. Pick one vector up and put the tail of one vector on the head of the other vector. Okay, and the sum of the two vectors is called the resultant vector, would go from the tail of one vector to the head of the other. Okay, and that blue vector that I drew there, starting at this point down here at the bottom and going to that ending point there, that would be the sum of those two vectors. Okay, so that's the general idea. Okay, if I had a vector that maybe looked like this, and I wanted to add those two vectors, same thing. You can add them head to tail. So you take the tail of one vector and you put it in the position of the head of the other vector. Might look something kind of like that. And the resultant vector, again, goes from the tail of the first vector to the head of the other vector. And that red vector there would end up being the sum of those two vectors. If you wanted to subtract two vectors, that can actually be done by basically adding a negative vector. A negative vector would go in the opposite direction of the original vector. So if I had a vector that looked like this, for example, the opposite of that vector would look like this. It would have basically 180-degree change in the direction. The two magnitudes would be the same. And so if you added those together, the head of one would end at the tail of the other one, and they would basically just cancel each other out. So if I wanted to subtract two vectors, say I had a vector that looked like this, and say I had a vector that looked like this, and I wanted to add those two vectors, vector 1 minus vector 2, let's say, we could just draw the negative version of vector 2, which is basically going in the opposite direction. And we could add those head to tail just like before. So let me see if I can pick this up and move it. So that would be the first vector minus the second vector. And anyway, we can get the resultant vector here by going from the tail of one vector to the head of the other. And that would be the difference between our original vector and this other vector over here. We added the opposite vector to that. Okay, so those are kind of some basics. In the next video, I'll talk about how you can represent vectors in a coordinate plane. It's handled a little bit differently. And I'll also talk about the idea of finding the magnitude of the vector. We'll do that in a different video, though.